Thank you, Ollie. I'm also going to welcome you to the third annual Deborah Friedman Memorial Lecture. And as Ollie said, I am Fern Tiger, and I'm a professor in the Urban Studies program. It's my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, and also to continue to tell you a little bit more about Debra, Chancellor Friedman, for whom the lecture series is named. Tonight's speaker brings passion, experience, and know-how to issues that Debra cared about deeply. And like Debra, our speaker acts on those issues: equity, access, engagement, and power, with deep commitment and resolve. Before I introduce Judith, I'd like to say a little bit about Debra, and in doing so, I think you'll find out, and you'll agree, that Debra and Judith are definitely kindred spirits. Debra's focus was always on what she called the work. And for those of us who knew her, we knew that meant purposeful and lasting activities that would truly change communities and bring access to the disenfranchised. Debra was focused on whole communities, and she had an uncanny ability to weave together seemingly disparate issues and ideas into programs whose impact would have vast reach. She understood the relationship between social, economic, and education systems, and she brought her passion for impacting all of those systems at once, at the same time, to the various cities in which she settled: Seattle, Phoenix, and Tacoma. I met Debra when she came to Phoenix to lead Arizona State University's College of Public Programs. I was on that faculty and was also leading an effort to socially embed the university into its many communities. While many faculty were reluctant to champion or even support this effort, Debra immediately embraced not just the notion, but the potential for its success, a drive she brought to UW with vigor and an intensity that she could have only dreamt about in Phoenix, given its size and its conservative politics. In her short 2.5 years in the South Sound, Debra was responsible for launching many programs that continue today, and for imbuing in this campus a special quality that some call urban serving, but which is actually less about service and more about empowering. As chancellor, she vigorously encouraged all of us to become active players in the life of this community. And now a little bit about our speaker. Judith Bell is the vice president of the San Francisco Foundation, a nearly 70-year-old philanthropic organization focused on Bay Area counties, but having a reach through its thinking and its programs far beyond Northern California. The foundation awards more than $100 million in grants annually and has, under Judith's masterful leadership, embarked on a unique and very public journey to expand racial and economic equity, acting fearlessly in its efforts to challenge the status quo and to bring voice to struggling communities. The foundation values the inherent strengths and knowledge of local residents and communities and works with them to identify systemic solutions to complex and often intractable problems. For Judith, this is a mandate, not just words. Prior to her current position at the foundation, Judith was the president of PolicyLink, a national research and action institute located in Oakland, Los Angeles, New York, and DC. She was one of the 4 founders of PolicyLink, which she confesses was started around her kitchen table. PolicyLink works to advance economic and social equity by, in their own words, lifting up what works. From a host of possible projects I could discuss that have Judith's signature on them, I'm going to mention just one. While at PolicyLink, Judith spearheaded the Center for Health Equity and Place, one of whose focuses has been access to healthy food, recognizing that this is an urgent issue for more than 30 million people living in communities with limited access to supermarkets. As Judith has written, and I quote, "Access to healthy food brings triple bottom-line benefits to communities, a revitalized economy, new jobs, and better health." In 2009, while at PolicyLink and with other partners, Judith initiated a national campaign to create a comprehensive response to this issue, which attracted the attention of the White House and First Lady Michelle Obama. It led to the Federal Healthy Food Financing Initiative, which has distributed more than $162 million in grants to about 100 projects across the nation and prompted more than $1 billion in new market tax credits. Judith is a graduate of the University of California, Santa Cruz and Harvard's Kennedy School of Public Policy. As an avowed activist, she cut her teeth professionally as the director of the West Coast Office of Consumer Affairs. So hopefully now you can see the connections. Two women, both tough and determined, accomplished, always up for a challenge. Two women focused on equity, access, and community. Two extremely intelligent and dedicated women. Two women who epitomize what is inscribed on Deborah's headstone, Tikkun Olam, for meaning in Hebrew, repair the world, and more loosely translated in contemporary terms to connote social action and the pursuit of social justice. And so tonight, we honor Deborah's legacy by bringing a speaker to UW-T whose work reminds us of that special passion for equity and change, for repairing the world. And while I knew Debra much more deeply than I know Judith, I can tell you now, and I hope you will agree, that Debra and Judith would have been fast friends.
Wow. Thank you for that introduction. That was just really, really moving and made me wish that I knew Debra. And my sister's name is Debra, so Deborah and Judith. I grew up almost as her twin, so it's a wonderful legacy that way as well. So when Fern first invited me, I did feel moved by Deborah's story, and it was really the first reason why I said yes to come to the University of Washington, Tacoma. And then I did a little research about the university and about what you represent, what you are focused on. See these words around here, and I also felt like there was alignment there as well. I was moved by this compass that you all use to drive your work and to keep you focused on your vision and values. I want to start tonight with a story. And I want you to imagine a 6-year-old boy playing with his sister in a dirt road next to a field. And outside, they can see their home and a little bit of a town. Their home's actually in a tavern where people stay when they're traveling. It's 1905, and it's in Lithuania. And they're playing in the road, and then all of a sudden they stop, and they look down the road where they begin to see horses coming and dust coming up from the horses' hooves, and they hear people yelling, and their play becomes infused with fear. And the sister drags the brother into a ditch where they cower as the horses come galloping by and the dust settles on them. And they are fearful because on the horses are Cossacks. And the Cossacks potentially are going to their village where they may destroy property, where they may hurt people. They particularly were hurtful to Jews, and these are 2 young Jews cowering in that ditch. That's the story that my grandfather used to tell us to explain why he and his family immigrated to the United States. Just about that time, his father, my great-grandfather, and 2 of his older brothers headed to the United States to try to work to make enough money to bring the rest of the family there. And sure enough, a few years later, enough money came that my grandfather, his mother, and his 6 sisters headed to Antwerp, where they caught a boat, and they traveled to the United States. They traveled in steerage, which was at the very bottom of the boat. And there was very little air, and most people were sick for the whole journey. My grandfather was sick the whole time. He hated boats after that, wouldn't even get on the Staten Island ferry. But it was a very long and difficult journey. But once they arrived at Ellis Island and they went through the process of clearing the health tests and the other things that were done, they reunited with my great-grandfather and my grandfather's 2 brothers. And then from there, the story is very much the story of an immigrant from that time, taking advantage of public education, of health, of his community, of his family. He became a dentist, and that served him well through the Depression, served him well for raising 3 sons. And I tell this story now. I tell it because I think we are at a moment of very big change. And it is a moment where I think remembering where we came from is a useful one. So what I want you to do right now is to turn to someone near you who you don't know and spend just a couple minutes exchanging the stories of where you're from. I'll give you about a minute or so, and then I'll have you switch so that each one of you gets a chance to talk. So find somebody nearby and ask this question of where did your family come from? Okay, let's come back this way. Hello? Okay, folks, here's what we're going to do now. Okay, we're going to use a little bit of polling technology here because we're going to bring in your stories all together into the room. So take out your phones. If you don't have a phone, if you have a computer, you can do it that way too. Okay, and here, this is just to see whether the technology is working. I do care who's here, but anyway. You either can go onto the web and use that web address, or you can text to 22333 and then put in Judith Bell 956 and then text your response to this question. Oh, I gotta clear, wait, let me clear this. Hold on one second. Let me clear this. Okay, now, text your responses. I wanna make sure this is working. People in? Okay, here we go. So far, just one community member. I'm betting there are other people in the room. Is it working for people? Is it clear how to do this? Okay. All right. No, you cannot vote twice. You cannot. You can try, but it won't work this time. Okay. People pretty much responded. All right. Okay, so now let's go to the next one. Okay, so this question, this is going to be a word cloud. So put in where your ancestors came from, where your family came from. One quick thing, if you put in 2 words, don't put in a space. Otherwise, they'll appear separately. Okay? Okay. Whoops, someone texted my name. I don't think that's where you're from. Uh-oh, many people texting that. You don't need to do it twice. Okay, so that gives us a sense of who's in the room and what each of your stories are. Okay, so now I want to start now talking some about equity. And I like to start by defining it, since it's a word that is used quite a bit now, but really hasn't been used that long. So the definition that I like to use is equity is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Now, usually when I say this, people feel like, oh, that's good, but what does that mean? So the next way I like to define it is this way. Shoes. Why is she showing a picture of shoes? The reason I'm showing a picture of shoes because equity, let's start this way. Equality is making sure everyone has a pair of shoes. But equity is making sure that everyone has a pair of shoes that fit. So equity, its very essence, is about figuring out what kinds of targeted strategies reflect where people are and can help people to be better able to participate and to be able to thrive. Let me give you an example of something that I think represents a kind of targeted strategy that also can lead to universal benefits. That's about equity. And that's curb cuts. You know, when curb cuts were first being debated, they were being debated from this perspective of, should we be investing in curb cuts to make it easier for the disabled to get around, so that people in wheelchairs wouldn't have to actually drive and move their wheelchairs along the streets, which is what they used to have to do. And so finally, after a lot of debate, curb cuts were put in effect. And then lo and behold, curb cuts are fabulous for all sorts of reasons. If you're a runner, curb cuts are great. You don't have to worry about tripping over the curb. If you're pushing a baby carriage, so much easier. If you're lugging luggage, so much better. If you're an older person, so much easier. So curb cuts were a targeted strategy that led to benefits for many people. So a sort of targeted universalism, if you will. So that's an important way to think about equity. Now, one other thing about equity, the other thing about equity is to think about it from the perspective of what it can mean for our country. So let me give you a sense now about what I'm going to cover this evening, the kind of themes that I'll touch on. So I want to start by talking about how the face of the country is changing, the kind of demographic change that we're in the middle of. I'm going to touch on how racial and economic inequality is high and persistent. I want to talk about how strong communities of color are necessary for the nation's economic growth and prosperity. How actually equity is an economic imperative. And then I want to take a step back to ask this question about how we got here. And then take a step forward to talk about the role of the philanthropic sector, give you a sense of what we're doing at the San Francisco Foundation to advance racial and economic equity. And then I want to talk some about leadership and advocacy in this time and in terms of the kind of change that can happen. Okay, so I'm now going to run you through a series of slides that show demographic change in the country and that give you a sense of what we have been in the midst of over the last several decades. So this is 1980, this is 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020, 2030, and 2040. By 2042, the nation will be majority people of color. And one thing I've learned about using these slides is that people feel like, wait, I didn't get to see it. So let's go back one more time so that you can see it and you can look at the different regions that you're curious about. Okay, so here's 1980, 90, 2000, 2010, 20, 30, 40. Okay, so now actually, let's take a look at what we just saw from a different perspective, just a different way of displaying the data, right? And the gray is white, right? Then black, then Latino, API, Native American, mixed other. And this just shows over time, right? The change that we are in the midst of as the nation is changing. And now I want to show you actually Tacoma. So here's Tacoma. Tacoma started with 82% white back in 1980, and now is just a little bit less than 60%. And actually, Tacoma will become majority people of color right around the same time as the nation. And now let me walk you through actually some slides that come actually from Allie's work. That take a look at Tacoma and the change in Tacoma over time. So this is the percent of non-Hispanic Asian population. This is 2000. Now keep in mind, these numbers are lower because the region didn't start as diverse. Okay, so there's 2000, there's 2010. Now let's take a look at the Latino population. This is 1990, this is 2000, and this is 2010. A lot of change. Okay, and then finally, let's look at foreign born. This is 1980, 90, and 2000, I think. And there's 2010. So a lot of change underway in this region and in the nation. And now here's a really important way to think about this. This showcases, right, what the makeup is in terms of percent people of color by age. And if you think about it, right, if we're going to be majority people of color by 1942, it's because the children who are being born represent that future. So we are looking at the future, right? Percent of youth who are people of color today, 43%. This is in your region, versus 17% for seniors. It speaks to a different reality you could be living in. If you're a young person or you spend your days connected to young people, you are in the midst of diversity, you are in the midst of the power, the opportunities, and the challenges of diversity. If you're an older person and you really just make that your world, you're living in a different world. And so there are all these questions now about who feels like they belong where and who feels like they are being othered in different places. And I think this slide actually really presents that in a stark way. We have found in research that places with the biggest gap have the biggest challenges in terms of who votes for things like supportive education and preschool, right? The challenges of people feeling like they are connected across the generations. Now let's take a look at Tacoma from the perspective of median household incomes, right? And if you look at this, you see that particularly blacks and Latinos and Native Americans or Alaskan Natives are making quite a bit less than whites. Here are the percent of Washington jobs that will require a bachelor's degree. So think about what the future is going to look like, right? The future will be majority people of color, will require a greater education, and when you take a look at this, what you see is that those who will represent the future are not anywhere close to where they need to be for education. So to have the folks available for our future workforce educated to where they need to be, we need to think about equity strategies. We need to think about investments in a way that will close that gap and that will allow us to have the educated workforce that we need. And now let's think about this from the perspective of, so what would happen? What would it mean if we actually made the kind of investments that could close the gap between what people of color are making and what whites are making? And when you do this analysis, the equity dividend for the nation is $2.1 trillion. That's about 14% GDP. That represents actually the entire economy of the state of California. And we are an economy that's the 8th largest in the country. And so that's a tremendous infusion. It's a ton of money. But when you start thinking about what does it mean for communities, it means greater monies for things like grocery stores, greater money for things like jobs and communities, greater money actually that will come into taxes for paying for education and universities and infrastructure. And so from the perspective of the nation, right, it's $2.1 trillion. Los Angeles would gain the most at $510 billion. Springfield, Missouri, which is 91% white, would gain the least, but still $287 million, a huge infusion into that community. And here in the Seattle-Tacoma metro, it would be $2.7 billion. So you can see how if we were able to close this disparity, we would all benefit because we would see that infusion of resources. We would see how equity actually can be so powerful and have such an economic return as well. So one last data slide here. And this is a data slide around home ownership. And I put this up for a very specific reason. You know, it's home ownership that drives the accumulation of wealth in this country, primarily for most people. And it's also home ownership in terms of where your home is that really can define what kind of wealth you have. And there are tremendous, actually, differentials in wealth in this country. The average white person, the median amount is a wealth of about $500,000. For African Americans, that's $95,000, and for Latinos, it's $112,000. So this gap in home ownership is part of also a gap in wealth by race. And now, I really want to start asking this question about how did we get here? How did we get to all those slides showing all those different gaps and all the questions we could go on and on about in terms of lack of access to opportunity? So how did we get here? So here's a quote. Recommended restrictions should include provision for the following. Prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. Anyone want to guess where that comes from? Any guesses? Okay, that is from the Federal Housing Administration. This is the language that was in the Federal Housing Administration. Now, let me talk just a moment about the Federal Housing Administration. You know, it revolutionized home ownership in this country. It opened up opportunity for families who had never had it before. And it opened up opportunities for white families. And it did it in a way of providing financing. And it did it by actually speaking to banks in terms of how they should finance homeownership. It actually, the FHA has insured over 35 million homes and has also financed 47,000 multifamily projects since 1934. So a tremendous power in our economy and a tremendous force also in terms of racial segregation. So this is from the Homeowners Loan Coalition, and that was actually the underwriting handbook that was used by the FHA. And just take a look at how different neighborhoods and how different places were defined in terms of where loans should go, right? Green, new, homogeneous areas in demand as residential location in good times and bad. Blue, areas that are pretty well built out but are stable. Yellow, areas where there is change. You can speak to change being essentially areas that were starting to be integrated or were close to African American communities. And red, this is how we got to the term of red, right? Of redlining. Areas in which things taking place in yellow neighborhoods had already happened. Black and low-income neighborhoods were considered to be the worst for lending. So banks took this instruction from the FHA, they took policy, federal policy, and they turned it into their institutional policy. They used it to figure out, as they were instructed, right, where they should send loans. And then the real estate industry followed up by doing something, inserting something into agreements and sales that were called restricted covenants. And these were agreements between the seller and the buyer that said, if you buy my home, you agree not to sell that home to an African American or a Latino, or in some cases, a Jew. And so here's a polling question for you. Until what year do restricted covenants exist in different communities around the country? Okay. Oh, I got to clear this. Hold on 1 second. Let me clear this. Okay. See what you think. Boom. Okay, the answer is 1968. So until 1968, restricted covenants existed. I live in the city of Berkeley, right, known for its liberal perspective and its liberal attitudes. And until 1968, restricted covenants were used in the city of Berkeley. There's a street that runs through Berkeley called Sacramento Street. And restricted covenants existed south of Sacramento, but not north of Sacramento. No, the other way around. They existed north of Sacramento, but not south of Sacramento. So the African American population was south of Sacramento. And to this day, the African American population is concentrated south of Sacramento. So you can see how these different tools, these different policies actually dramatically changed the landscape of communities and really led to reinforcing and essentially establishing racial segregation, right? These rules that we saw that were used by the FHA and used by banks, they're really what fueled the suburbanization. They're what allowed families to step in and to purchase homes in suburbs and then to build up their wealth and consequently actually to lead to an awful lot of segregation around the country. So here's this quote, which I think just so perfectly summarizes the power of housing discrimination, right? If you sought to advantage one group of Americans and disadvantage another, you could scarcely choose a more graceful method than housing discrimination. Housing determines your access to transportation, green spaces, decent schools, decent jobs, and decent services. Housing affects your chances of being robbed, shot, as well as your chances of being stopped and frisked. And housing discrimination is as quiet as it is deadly. Housing discrimination is hard to prove, hard to detect, and hard to prosecute. So the implications of these policies are really quite extreme. And people have now, over the last several years, looked at research to try and figure out, well, how does this translate in terms of individuals? And so there's been this long-standing debate about what's more impactful on your life expectancy, your genetic code or your zip code. Okay, well, you've already answered the next poll, so maybe we'll just go right ahead. And that actually is the case. We don't have to do this one because you are correct. That is the answer. So how does that translate, right? Okay. All right, we're just going to leave it at that. How does that translate? This is a picture of MacArthur Boulevard. It's a major thoroughfare in Oakland. Depending on which side you live on, 10-year difference, a 10-year difference in life expectancy. Place has an enormous implication for health. Atlanta, Georgia. Depending on what side you live on of Highway 75, a change of 12 years in life expectancy. Okay, this is regardless of whether you're a white person or African American, depending on where you live, this is how you can expect life expectancy. Chicago, this is a north-south, right, differential, 16 years. Richmond, Virginia, 20 years. Just think about how profound that is. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of students who aren't even 20, right? The differential and what it means for people, what it means for communities, and also what it means in terms of strategies that are focused on equity, that you have to pay attention both to people and to places. Much better in this area, right? 4 years, still substantial, but much better along the I-90 corridor. So place is a huge and important component to be thought through as we think about equity. And so place is very critical in the context of community philanthropy. And so now what I want to do is give you a sense about what community philanthropy can do to advance greater racial and economic inclusion. And first, let me do a little bit of defining. So San Francisco Foundation, you heard from Fern, we are the Bay Area's community foundation. And community foundations are different than private foundations. Private foundations like the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, right? Those are private foundations. Community foundations are tied to donors and are constantly in this process of connecting with individual donors and working with those donors in their own philanthropy. The San Francisco Foundation, as I said, is 5 counties. We have $1.3 billion in assets. We have 675 donor partners. What does that mean? We have these funds, donors come to us. They say, either they say, I want you to just help move dollars in whatever way I want to for my own philanthropic journey. Or they say, I'd like to work with you and get your advice about how to use my resources in a way that can advance an agenda. These days they would say to advance an agenda for greater racial and economic inclusion in the region. We are pretty large as community foundations go. We're somewhere in the top 10 or so. And it allows us, we have about $800 million that's endowed, so those dollars are at our disposal, and the rest are from these donor-advised funds. So let me give you context for the Bay Area. So about 2.5 years ago, a new CEO came to the San Francisco Foundation, and he brought with him a notion that it was time for the foundation to embrace racial and economic equity as its new North Star. And in an exploration to figure out what that should mean for how the foundation operated, we asked for a regional equity profile. We looked at the data to better understand the region. And so let me walk you through just a few things to set the context, right? We are one of the most diverse regions, right? We are number 2. Number 1 is Vallejo Fairfield in California, just a little bit further east from us. So we're the second most diverse region in the country. The region actually became majority people of color right around 2000 to 2010, right in that. So we're a very diverse region. We already look like what the country will look like. In fact, the whole state looks like what the country will look like in 2042. And we are a region that is dealing with rising inequality, right? We are the 14th most unequal region in the country. Anyone want to guess the top 5 most unequal? Come on, take a wild guess. New York City, number 1. Number 2 is Miami. 3, Los Angeles. 4, Houston. And 5, Memphis. The most equal cities, anyone want to guess? Salt Lake City. Number 2 is Virginia Beach. Number 3 is Minneapolis. 4 is Las Vegas. And 5 is Riverside, California. And you are at 25th, so right smack in the middle. So that gives you a sense of what the region is dealing with. So we went out to figure out our equity agenda, and we went out first and listened. We went out in a series of what we called voices sessions. We spoke to more than 1,000 people all over the region. We were all over those 5 counties in all sorts of different communities. And we asked in each of those sessions, we said to folks, okay, think about the opportunities and the challenges in your community. Think about the region. Think about the San Francisco Foundation, and tell us what you think it should look like for us to embrace an agenda of racial and economic equity. We brought together consultative sessions. The foundation had historically been organized along 5 different issue areas. And so we went to our partners and experts in each of those areas, and we asked the same kind of question in a longer and deeper conversation. We reached out to our donors to figure out from a donor perspective, how would you think about this agenda? How would you want to be partnered with the San Francisco Foundation as a donor to advance racial and economic equity? And then we went out to figure out, just from also the perspective of leaders we'd been engaged in for decades, to get their reflections of that. And then we took a deep dive into data. It felt like drinking water from a fire hose, because we just looked at equity in all sorts of different ways. We used 3 different lenses. We used the lens of race, the lens of place, and the lens of income, because we found that depending on which lens you chose, you came to understand the region and its opportunities and its challenges from a different perspective, and that it was instructive each time to look at the data. So let me give you a sense of how that data came out. Okay, so this is looking at wages, right? This is sort of an income analysis, and looking at what happened over time in the Bay Area in the United States for wages comparing from 1979 to 2008-12. And you can see, right, for the Bay Area, huge increases for higher income, way more than happened nationally. More increases going down right into the 50th percentile, but then you can see, right, how much people did not gain over that time period if they were poor or if they were working class. So one way to understand, right, economic equity. And then here is a way of looking at opportunity. Okay, so high opportunity is that green color, right? Yellow is middle opportunity and low is gray. Think about jobs that have real ladders that allow you to climb up that ladder rung by rung to get access to greater opportunity, greater income, greater wealth, greater responsibility. And what you can see, right, if you start looking at the distribution, right, of high opportunity, you can see that is heavily concentrated for white and actually for API US born. And that low opportunity is heavily concentrated for Latinos in particular, and then for API immigrants. Also really important distinction for us to take in as we were beginning to understand the region from these different lenses. And then finally for us, something that is particularly important are the pressures of displacement. We live in a real estate market that I do not wish on anyone. You know, people say, oh, we want to have a thriving real estate market. And I say, you do not want a market as hot as ours. So these are displacement pressures, right? And that purple color, I know it's the color of your university, but in this case, it's not a good color. The purple color is advanced gentrification. And just like to pick a neighborhood, you know, West Oakland up here is purple. West Oakland was known as the Harlem of the West. It was a vibrant African-American community. And now it has got gentrification. There are $1 million condos, Fern was just telling me, that are being built in West Oakland, unheard of even a decade ago. So a lot of pressure, people being pushed out, way out, looking at 2-hour commutes in each way to get to jobs. It has created an enormous amount of pressures that then translates into transportation problems, translates into people trying to figure out how to hire teachers and firefighters, not to mention janitors and people working in hotels. So a dramatic pressure for us. So we pulled all this together, and what did it tell us? It told us that focusing on racial and economic equity should translate into an agenda about people, place, and power. And people, from the context of thinking about expanding access to opportunity, place from that context of figuring out how to hold on to anchoring communities, communities that can anchor by race, by culture, let people live in the communities that they have chosen, and power from the standpoint of not being able to advance this agenda without building power. Let me just give you a sense of how that work has begun to translate. This is actually a photo from the east side of Oakland. It speaks to the importance of culture in the context of place. And then what we have been doing as a foundation, right, we have really been thinking about both what we want to do differently and how we want to work differently. So thinking about how we want to partner with our donors, how we want to build public-private partnerships, and how we want to be a part of exercising our civic leadership. So just this last November, there was $2.5 billion put on the ballot for housing bonds to help us spur the production of affordable housing across the region. And the foundation did both grant making to help move those measures onto the ballot, and we did grant making to help with Get Out the Vote. And we exercised our civic leadership in speaking out in favor of the measure, and we reached out to those that we knew in the real estate industry and beyond to build their support for these measures so they could pass. In California, passing a bond requires a 2/3 vote. So we needed to make sure that there was not going to be opposition to those measures. And in fact, in Alameda County, where we put a lot of effort, those measures passed without opposition. And they are now spurring a lot more resources into the development of affordable homes for everyone. In the context of people, Emeryville, which is a small little city in our region, has been one of the leaders in raising the minimum wage and in changing the quality of work for workers. I was speaking with a worker leader relatively recently, and she said to me that before the minimum wage was raised, she had to have her daughter move in with someone else because she couldn't afford food for her daughter in addition to paying rent. And that once the minimum wage went up, her daughter could move back in with her. So working from the context of raising wages and then also improving access to opportunity. This is Michael, and Michael came out of the criminal justice system and he went to work in a social enterprise that trained him up in the context of work and began to give him skills in logistics. He then has been promoted a couple times and now is a supervisor. So a powerful arena for expanding access to opportunity. And then finally, in the context of power, I want to tell you the story of Sergey Hernandez, who now works for Mobilize the Immigrant Vote, and talks about how when her family were farm workers, she was sitting in a car outside a field, and she saw her family come running out from what looked almost like a cloud. And they were coughing, and they were sick and vomiting, and they jumped in the car, and they sped off to try and get some health care. And it turned out that they had been poisoned by pesticides. They tried actually to sue the farmer, but were not successful. But Sergey held that vision, and she went on to work through her degree at UC Berkeley, and now works for an organization that seeks to help immigrants both become citizens, become voters, and to think about their engagement and their power. It's Mobilize the Immigrant Vote, and it's a group that the foundation has been supporting over many years. So I want to do a couple different things now. I have this up as a way of talking about art also in the context of building power. The way that looking at this moves us, the way that it helps us to understand the movement for Black Lives Matter, and the way that it helps us also to think about what we have to hold in our minds as we advance through an effort and through campaigns around racial and economic equity. So this work really takes different kinds of leadership. And it takes different kinds of leadership over time. You know, after the election, we asked ourselves, how we should respond, what we needed to do as a philanthropic institution, what kinds of challenges it would bring to people in our region. Our region has about 300,000 undocumented residents. And so we knew after the election that for all of those folks and for many immigrants, there would be fear. We had planned to have a rapid response fund, a way for folks to get resources quickly when they needed to take action. We'd planned that as part of rolling out our power work, but we moved it much faster. Within 2 weeks, we launched this rapid response fund for activists to come to us for small grants of like $3,000 to $15,000 that we can move in 2 weeks, which for a philanthropic institution is like unheard of. I mean, you can put in a request, and if you hear 6 months later, it's considered a great thing. So 2 weeks was a big deal. So we rolled this out 2 weeks after the election, and now we've done about $350,000 in grants. And most of these grants, as you can see from this, have gone around immigrant rights. Not really surprising given the time. They have gone for Know Your Rights sessions. They have gone to sessions that help families make plans, who will take care of their children, who will handle finances, who will pay the rent. And they have gone actually to UC Berkeley students, students who are there on the Deferred Action Program, came to us and asked us to fund a text messaging system so that students could be warned if ICE was coming onto campus, and also to do Know Your Rights sessions. So this gives you a sense of how a rapid response fund can be helpful both in movement building and in helping people to know what they can do to fight for their own rights. As I was saying, the Rapid Response Fund is tied to this larger strategy that we have. Back in January, we opened up the first time that we've done equity grants. And we opened it up, we thought of this as, okay, let's just let people come through our door. Let's present a suite of opportunities and let them come in and tell us along these definitions of people, place, and power how they think we should do our grant making. Well, you have to be a little careful what you wish for. We opened the door, we had 960 requests come in. That's about a 35% increase. We were responsive to folks. They had asked us, the history of the foundation for grant making is sort of the peanut butter approach. Small grants, $30,000. People said we need bigger grants, we need more core support, and we need multi-year grants. So we said to people, okay, in this cycle, $100,000 a year, and you can ask for 3 years. You can ask as much as $300,000. So hence $123 million in requests. That's 6 times more than we've ever gotten before. So we are right in the middle of this. And it is raising questions for us about partnership. It is raising questions for us about what can be the best and most targeted strategies to advance equity, and is also raising questions for us how to better develop those partnerships with our donors, with other philanthropic institutions, and with the public sector as well. Foundations seek to make grants to help spur innovation. Foundations seek to make grants to demonstrate what could be possible in terms of getting to change. And foundations seek to make these grants to ultimately, the biggest hope is you do something like, for instance, we're in the middle of an effort that is focused around absenteeism in schools. And we started supporting having parents and others act as advocates to figure out if a kid is absent. If a kid is absent, that is going to lead to the kid falling behind, right? It's going to lead to the kid not being able to perform, and then that can lead to all sorts of discipline problems, et cetera. So we have helped bring in parents to figure out what's the real issue behind absence. And now what we have found in the schools where we've started it, absenteeism has dropped by 50%. So ultimately, what do you want to see? That kind of a program be adopted by a school district, be turned into something that can get to scale, that can keep kids in the classroom. So all of this is about leadership. And so what I want to ask you to do now is to think about the 2 words you think describe the most important qualities of a leader. And it's going to be another word cloud. So go ahead and respond, and let's see what people think. The 2 words you think describe the most important qualities of a leader. Okay, listening, intelligence, empathy, trust, very important. Judith Bell again, I don't know. Listening. See how these words, right? The more people answer the same, right? The more you see. So there, right? Look at the different answers that people have given. Compassionate, respect, humility, inspiring, fierce, integrity, hope, intelligence. Okay, now what I want you to do is to think about, let me clear this. Think about which two words, right, describe the kind of leader you aspire to be. The kind of leadership that you try to bring in the context of your daily work, regardless of what you do. What are the 2 words describe the kind of leader you aspire to be? Intersectional, kind, passionate, empathetic, not colonizing. Visionary, thoughtful, right? You know, I think of leadership sometimes as each of us almost has a tagline. You know, earlier when Fern was talking about Policy Link, she said that our tagline is lifting up what works, right? It tells you something about the institution. A friend of mine who's a CEO of an organization, she says her tagline is, she'll do what she says. Right? I think it's important for each of us to think about what kind of a tagline goes with our leadership. How do we want people to be able to understand us and what they can count on us to do as leaders? Okay, so here's a quiz for you to think about different leaders. This is not going up on your computers or your phones. Okay, I'm sure everyone knows number 1, right? Martin Luther King. These are different kinds of leaders. Number 2, right, Cesar Chavez. Number 3, getting the challenge here. Anybody know? That's Ella Baker. Ella Baker was probably one of the most important civil rights leaders, women civil rights leaders, and she and Martin Luther King had an ongoing debate about leadership. Ella Baker believed that leadership should be more distributed. Ella Baker believed that community leaders' voices should be instrumental, and she was opposed to singular leaders. So you can see what kind of debate they had. She was responsible for mentoring all sorts of leaders that became civil rights leaders over time. Number 4, Roosevelt. Number 5, very good, Alicia Garza, leader from the Black Lives Matter movement. Number 6, I knew that would get you. That's Erica Andiola, and she is a leader from the Dreamers movement. She actually came into public life by posting a video of immigration agents coming into her home and taking her mother and her brother. Number 7, Mary Kay Henry, she's the head of SEIU, largest union in the country. And number 8, very good, David Koch of the Koch brothers. So a whole different set, right? Different kinds of leaders, different kinds of approaches. And, you know, what I want, oops, here are their names. What I want to talk about now, as I start to wrap up, what I want to talk about is, you know, I've spent my career as an advocate. And I have, over time, really thought about the principles that I think are important in the context of advocacy, right? Advocacy is just really thinking about being dedicated to advancing change. And I think they really are separated into 3 different categories, right? The personal, work, and campaign. So from a personal perspective, right? As an advocate, I strive to be factual and accurate. I spent a lot of time lobbying in the California legislature, and it was so important that every time I spoke, whomever I was speaking to could take what I was saying to the bank, right? They knew it would be factual, it would be honest, it would be accurate. Being respectful. You know, I used to take students with me when I would lobby. And one of the things I would say to them was respect was hugely important, but it was also strategic. You know, you needed to be respectful to that secretary. Why? Because everyone deserves respect. And why else? Because you weren't going to get a meeting with the member if that secretary didn't feel respected. And that's what you wanted. Work principles. You know, if you could do it by yourself, it's probably not worth doing. And so the importance of building partnership and being in the context of community building. Very rare, maybe it never happens, that you get from here to your goal in a straight line the way you planned it. You have to be flexible, and you have to be able to listen along the way to be flexible. And then too often we focus more on inputs than we do on results. What's the change we are seeking, and how do we make sure that it will matter, and it will matter to the people that we are working with in partnership? So a focus on results, a focus on goals, and a focus on making sure you have a plan to get there. And then from a campaign perspective, right, when you're engaging in trying to move change, what do you need? You need stories, right? As humans, what moves us are stories. What will you walk out of this room remembering? I'm willing to bet you will remember the story that you shared with the person you didn't know. Maybe there's a story I've told that will move you and that you will hold on to. It is the power of stories. They are how we frame issues. It's how we understand issues. It's how we are moved to action. And then in the context of campaigns, to always strive to be on the offense, to not get sidetracked, to raise the stakes, to be focused on those results with laser focus, and to hold on to what you were trying to do. And then at the same time, you have to sustain yourself. You know, this is not short-term work. This is a marathon. And I don't know if people have run a marathon, but I have been a runner for decades. And what do you learn? You have to keep training. You have to pace yourself. You have to pay attention to yourself. You have to maintain perspective. You have to have people who are with you, people whose phone calls, email, text, whatever you know you will respond to, they will respond to you. They will help give you sustenance. They will help you make it through. And you have to have a life. And we all define our lives in different ways, but you have to have a life to sustain yourself in the middle of change. And then, you know, it's really never over. I'm now old enough to say, like, these fights continue. And so you have to sustain yourself so you can be in it over the long haul and so that you do not quit. You know, I think of this work as really being about your head, your heart, and your hands. That it's from all, just like I was talking about all those different ways of understanding equity, I think in the context of the work, that the work is successful when we bring our heart into it, when we bring our feelings, when we bring our thoughts, and we bring our physical being into the work. You know, I want to end actually by speaking to the students in the room. You know, I was thinking about this, and I have these totally conflicting views about this moment and about the nature of change and advocacy and leadership and fighting for racial and economic equity in this moment. And the two opposing emotions are first, guilt. I feel guilty for where we are today in the fight for greater racial and economic equity. I feel guilty that we are not further along, and I feel guilty for what we are struggling with today. But then at the same time, you know, on the opposite end of that coin, I feel envy. I feel jealous. Why? Because, you know, it's very rare that we have these moments. This is a movement moment, right? It's a moment where people are so moved that they are stepping up to find their voice, to find the way that they're engaged, to find what they are willing to fight for and to come together. And that young people are coming together in completely different ways than we have ever seen before. Whether it's ways of advocacy, whether it's waves of pushing for something or reacting against it, there is an incredible sense of momentum now. And so in this moment, I want to encourage each of you to figure out how you want to exercise your leadership, how you want to be a part of change, how you want to see and be a part of advancing racial and economic equity. You know, it's really clear that it's not just a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative. But it's an imperative for all of us, and something I think that each of us can bring our leadership, can bring our heads, our hearts, and our hands, and I believe that then we will see the changes that all of us are hoping for. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. So questions. We have time for some questions, and there are mics. There's one, And there's another
Two
one
mics.
somewhere. So I have some questions, but if there are people ready to go, I'll hold off on mine. Okay, there and there, okay?
Hi, just a quick question. When you're using Bureau of Labor statistics numbers and stuff like that, we work with that. I think there's a lot of people that have fallen off. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
There.
Data is only as good as, not perfect by any stretch.
Julia? Oh,
Absolutely right.
over there. Whoop.
All the way in back there.
Oh, she had her hand up too.
Oh, sorry.
It's over here,
Right
right
here.
there.
She's coming to you. Go ahead.
Hello, I just wanted to thank you and also ask if you were aware of something called a report called the Wealth Gap that I think they highlighted on NPR in the past year, and it actually came up with a handful of policy recommendations at the end for what the next president might put their efforts towards. And I just wanted to know from your perspective, it really feels like all of this is a result of a continuous policy failures. So what would you give if there were like 2 or 3 things you'd say this is where effort should be put towards that could really get a wellspring of movement going?
Well, there are many different approaches, and I hesitate to say like which two, because we need so many different things, right? And I think some of it is about like what is most important to you in that context. I would say, to focus on education equity and what that can look like in different communities. We have this ongoing and pernicious achievement gap, right? A gap between how students of color perform versus white students, completely unrelated to people's potential. We are not figuring out how to allow every child to reach their full potential. But actually, we're not figuring it out, but we could. There are plenty of examples of how we can close the achievement gap, examples actually where people have successfully even flipped that achievement gap. So I think one thing would be to focus on the achievement gap and focus on educational equity. And then, of course, right, education translates into things like income and wealth over time. And then I think the other thing we need to do is to focus on the criminal justice system. We made huge mistakes decades ago when we decided that we were going to turn ourselves into a society in which it was the punishment economy, the punishment system. And we have begun to figure out that that doesn't work. But in the meantime, we have, hundreds, I forget what the figure is, but like hundreds of thousands of people in prison, most of whom are there for non-violent offenses. So I just think we have to take a very different approach. We have to figure out both how we help people who exit, and we have to figure out how to redefine things in a way that does not continue the punishment frame and instead starts to look at things like restorative justice and other approaches. Yes. Go ahead.
I just have a nuts and bolts question for you. The Rapid Response Fund for movement building, how did you decide what reporting information you would want from the different organizations or groups that you funded?
So we decided actually not to ask for a whole lot of reporting at all. We decided that we really needed this to be rapid response. We wanted to focus on smaller organizations. So we're asking for like the very minimum of reporting back. It is very different from what we asked for from a grant. Yeah, it's considered pretty radical.
Ryan?
Yes, in the back.
Ryan?
So philanthropy is famously fickle.
Yeah.
And everyone in communities that are fortunate enough to have community foundations, everyone wants to be the beneficiary of a community foundation. So you've selected a more narrow issue area. It's very compelling. What are some of the challenges that come up for all of the folks who don't see themselves reflected in your work or want to be a part of it and don't fit? How do you navigate that?
Great question. So as Fern mentioned, we've been around since 1948. So we've been around a long time, and the foundation actually has been focused on social justice really since we started. So from that standpoint, though, that's still a pretty broad, you're right, a pretty broad definition, and equity does fit in here. So a few things. One thing, so there are two ways to think about this. So 960 right applications came in, and there were a slice of those that were not about equity. Okay, so that's one conversation. How do we have that conversation? You know, it's a difficult conversation, but we have it from the standpoint of both recognizing the value of people's work and having a conversation about why we think these need to be our priorities right now. We did, in anticipation of rolling out this agenda, give transition grants to all the folks who had any kind of a relationship with the foundation. So if you had gotten, 1, 2, whatever number of grants, if you had any sense of a relationship, we gave you a transition grant. It was our way of signaling to folks that we were in the midst of change and we didn't know what our grant making was going to look like in the future. We also have a broader range of organizations that we recommend to donors, so that's another way that folks can see some resources coming. But you're right that there are now some organizations that have had grants from the San Francisco Foundation for a long time that are no longer grantees. And one thing I would say is, the end of June will announce this set of equity grants, and that's when I think we'll get the most pushback. We'll get the most pushback because, we had that 960, we took 700 off, but there are at least, I'd say 300, 400, 500 of those grantees total who are doing work focused on equity, right? They legitimately can come and say, here's how our work is about equity. And so then we have to explain why we've chosen the ones we have. We are working to certain outcomes, right? We're working to certain results. And the best we can say to people is, this is how we're seeing it now. We will open up again next year. We will work to connect you in best as we can, and that we still look to you as being a part of this broader community and this broader effort that we're engaged in. But it is not easy.
Is it on?
Is that on?
Yeah.
Okay. I really
there you are.
appreciate breaking it down into the people, place, and power. That helps. So in relation to the place, have you seen any examples of cities and small government being pressured or taking the initiative to do their investments more equitably into all of the neighborhoods in their jurisdiction, so that you're starting to build value in low-income communities through the infrastructure investments, better parks, better sidewalks, better, basic services. Have you seen any examples of that approach to improving communities through the local investments, government investments?
And here's a very strange but powerful example. The Public Utilities Commission in San Francisco. I bring it up because across the country, there are water agencies that are making multi-billion-dollar investments, right, to upgrade the systems. They've been pushed by the EPA and by others. So in San Francisco, the Public Utilities Commission is making a $6 billion investment. And a lot of that investment is actually focused in low-income communities. In particular, in the southeast of San Francisco, one of the poorest neighborhoods, they have had a facility there that has been polluting that community for decades. And so now they are both upgrading that facility and they are working with the community to figure out what kind of a community park and what kind of a community center they're going to build there. This is from decades of advocacy about this facility. And they are requiring every single contractor to define the community benefit that they will bring as part of their contract. Who will they hire? What community groups will they work with? What will they do in terms of who they will purchase from, right, for the supplies that they need? And these are so competitive that the scoring on that piece of the contract really matters. The good news is that the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission is in the vanguard, but there are actually other public utilities around the country that are banding together to take on this approach, to define that investment in a way that, yes, will get us better water systems, but will also get us workers trained up for living wage jobs, people certified for the kinds of jobs that they can have over the long term with the Public Utilities Commission, and with benefits back from communities that have been waiting for decades to not instead have pollution coming into their communities.
Another question? Anybody?
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm a senior studying here at the University of Washington, and I really appreciate the last bit that you had spoken to us about a student, and it kind of lights the fire again. But the question I have is, what are like some words of encouragement when someone like me, starts to work in the city or work in, a jurisdiction and starts to face like bureaucracy and kind of seeing those things? What are some like words of inspiration,
Water in there? I don't think there's any water in there.
Cheers.
Well, here's the good news, is that Seattle actually started a lot of this work of embedding equity into government. And now around the country, there is a whole actually network called the Government Alliance for Racial Equity. It's run by something called the Center for Social Inclusion. And it's focused on people in government at all sorts of different layers, identifying the very kind of policies I was talking about, right? Policies that are embedded there that are actually having impacts, inequitable impacts, and then having folks begin to work through what change could look like, using equity as a way of defining how they develop every kind of policy. I mean, I'll give you an example. In West Oakland, their garbage is not picked up on the same kind of schedule as it is from a middle-class community, right? But if government begins to take a look at those kinds of questions, really down to that minutia, it starts to translate in a different way. So I think actually regardless of what job you end up with, whether it's in government, whether it's in the social justice sector, or whether it's in the corporate community, you can begin to figure out how you can translate the quest for equity in the context of your work. You can't right away come in and try and blow things up, because that's just not the way it works. But you can begin to figure out, okay, who are your allies? Who are other people who come with a similar perspective? What are the kinds of bigger changes you could see, and what are the smaller steps to getting there? Even for corporations, translating equity into economic impacts can translate and change the way corporations address the very essence of their work. The Gap, for instance, the Gap Foundation started an internship for young people of color in retail. And then what they began to show to the corporation was that having that workforce actually helped the bottom line. Those interns stayed longer, they performed better, and because of that, they translated actually into dollars and cents on the bottom line. And so now the corporation is adopting this as a practice for the corporation. So that's a way of starting to figure out what kinds of approaches you can take that are equity infused that will become corporate policy, because they will positively impact the bottom line.
Okay, we have time for maybe 2 more questions, so.
So I just have a question about, on your advocacy rules, you talked about work and building community and partnership, and I was wondering if you, as the foundation, if it looks to leverage what it does by partnering also with other foundations, because I was thinking, I think your focus is admirable, but one of the things that frustrates me is I believe in social justice issues, but also in environmental issues, and I think there's a lot of connection between the two. I could put almost anything into an equity issue, in terms of access or healthcare outcomes or pollution exposure, things like that. But I can see where you might really be able to leverage what you've got by partnering with. Yeah,
absolutely true. I mean, I could name all sorts of initiatives. I'll name 2 for you. So we're part of something called the Great Communities Collaborative, which focuses on transit-oriented development and thinks about impacts around climate and climate justice. And that has about 10 different foundations around the table and actually has public sector partners. We're involved in something called Hope SF, which is focused on the transformation of public housing and the residents of those public housing in the southeast part of San Francisco. That's a partnership with banks, it's a partnership with foundations, and it's a partnership with the city and county of San Francisco. And then we're involved in something called the Bay Area Workforce Collaborative, which is a combination of employers and foundations focused on increasing workforce development for communities that have historically been left behind. So all the time we're looking to partner with the philanthropic sector and with the private sector and also with the public sector. So you are absolutely right. We're pretty small as foundations go, and so we know we have to be in partnership in order to succeed.
One last question, Sarah?
So my question was more about the attendance accountability that you were talking about with students. Was that pertaining to elementary students? And has that been running long enough to see any data of successful outcomes with that as far as graduation?
No, we're not there yet. We're tracking it, but we're not there yet. But there is an organization called Attendance Works, and it's national, and it has that data. It has the data that showcases that when you focus on attendance, then kids, because they're in school, they learn better and it leads to better outcomes. So we're partnered with Attendance Works, and we have confidence because of their history that this will lead to greater graduation rates and will lead then to kids having different kinds of opportunities for work and success.
Thank you. Once again, can we get a round of applause for our speaker?